Well, everybody, welcome to today's webinar. Welcome to I call this our mini series in July, where I pick out some of our most requested topics and we do webinars on those topics in the month of July. So this is always a fun month for me, and I know for some of our instructors as well. Just a couple of notes for those of you who might be new to the program. As always, for those of you who are regulars, welcome back. But for anyone who's new, this is a webinar format, and so we can't see you or hear you during this class. If you have any questions, you're going to actually type those into the Q&A box on your Zoom menu. When we start taking questions, which we will be doing a lot of during this session, you can type your questions in there. There is also a chat box, which I'm activating. It's a little bit more difficult for me to track the questions that come in through the chat box, but if you want to send them through there, that's fine too. I'll be monitoring that. And as a reminder, we are recording this session. So if you have to leave early or if you want to access it later, you can go to our YouTube channel starting tomorrow and it will be available on our YouTube channel. I think that is it for me. All right, so for those of you who don't know Caitlin, Caitlin is one of our plant specialists and she really specializes in our native plants. She's one of our authorities really on all things related to natives, plants, pollinators, all that stuff that we love to talk about in the summer especially. So I asked her to come in today to chat with us about her experiences with native plants and some of her knowledge about, if you all have heard about the Mount Cuba studies and some other studies that have been done studying the native cultivars. So, Caitlin, you're going to have to jump in if I get any of this incorrect. So I wanted her to come in and take questions from you all and discuss a little bit about that. So what I'm going to do is start out with some questions to Caitlin to give you all some time to start typing your questions in. And after she gets through those first couple of questions, we're just going to open it up to you all so you guys can ask Caitlin questions, any questions you have about native plants. The one thing I will note is we're going to try and prioritize questions that are really more general to the applicable, more appealing to the general audience. So we're happy to address plant clinic type stuff if you're having issues with specific plants or very specific conditions, but we may not get to those today. But if we don't, we can follow up with you after class. We can refer you to the plant clinic, whatever you need. So just be aware of that in advance. All righty, Caitlin. So you and I discussed, first of all, welcome. Thanks for joining me. I know you and I have talked a lot about native plants over the last couple of years. And we were discussing, the importance of natives and how the team has been so invested in spreading the word about native plants to everybody. And you had mentioned specifically how important it is to talk about why our work promoting native plants is important. So do you want to start talking a little bit about your experience with native plants and why you believe they're so important and why it's important for the store to carry them?
So I think it is imperative. One of my favorite go-tos as far as resources is Doug Tallamy. And Doug Tallamy points out in several of his books and also a couple really good Zooms online. They're on YouTube. He points out that 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. He also says that we need our yards to be about 70% native in order for us to sustain native plant populations. And a lot of that just starts with having the plants that support the insects, which ultimately provide pollination. Their caterpillars feed our birds. You've got 96% of our bird populations rely on caterpillars for feeding their young. And a single brood, and some birds have multiple broods, can eat anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. So it's super imperative just thinking of the little guys by planting natives. And I think Merrifield is at this really nice position where there are exclusively native nurseries, and a lot of their consumers are the people that are actively searching it out, like the folks attending this webinar. They're the ones that know they want natives and they're looking for the natives. Merrifield not only provides natives for those customers, but we also deal with so many customers on a regular basis that we're able to expand their interests. So maybe someone just wants some hedges and they see this beautiful native display and they start talking to our colleagues. And that's when we can start to turn them on, because one of the bigger things is if your yard is attractive and you have natives and you are also part of a community and encouraging your neighbors to do the same, whether it's through a stunning aesthetic visual in your yard, or as we keep working outside and developing these outdoor living spaces, we tend to be out there more ourselves. So by participating in this movement, buying products that will encourage the nursery industry to grow more natives, and also participating in a community effort, we can create green corridors, spaces from one yard to the next, which allows a lot of access to resources for our wildlife.
That's great. I don't know if I've told you this, but I actually got my mom, who has had zero interest in gardening until I came back. I moved and nearby and started growing all of these plants, and suddenly she's planting native plants in containers all over her balcony. She had no interest in gardening, grew nothing, and
It's
now
continue.
suddenly she's into it. So yeah, it's kind of neat to watch that happen. And we've seen that happen at the store over the last few years. More and more interest has developed in these plants.
Yes,
Okay, next question for you. You and I have done a lot of online classes together. And when we're doing these classes, we talk about the cultivars of native plants, which I think you mentioned how we develop, or people develop, more and more cultivars, the more interest there is in native plants. So I know about the Mount Cuba studies, and you mentioned the Annie White studies. Can you discuss a little bit what's going on in these research fields to develop these cultivars of native plants for customers?
absolutely. So Annie White was one of the first research projects. She was based out of the University of Vermont. And she started as a student. She's now a professor and a PhD and runs an ecological design company in New England. But when she was going through school, she had noticed that there was a real shortage on research between native plants and then the cultivars of natives. And I will use this time just to mention that a native plant, a straight species, is something that naturally occurs. It has been there for hundreds, thousands, even, all the way back. That's how long those plants have been there prior to us colonizing the United States. Then you've got things like nativars. So a nativar is a naturally occurring cultivar, or it is a naturally occurring trait that we have continually bred. So an example is Phlox paniculata giana. It was found in Tennessee. I think it's on the Harpeth River. Very small clusters, which is unusual to the straight species. And this was something that we had plucked from the wild and continued to cultivate and cultivate and cultivate. So that would be a great example of a nativar. And then cultivars are very targeted traits, whether it's height or bloom colors or bloom duration or even disease resistance. So for that reason, we sometimes will develop a Echinacea purpurea, or we might hybridize it where it's a cross between purpurea and Echinacea tennesseanensis. So just putting that out there right away, the difference between a straight species native, a nativar, and a cultivar. Now, what Annie White did was she took 15 different species. So she'd have Echinacea purpurea, and she would basically document how many insects, and this is by monitoring the insects visiting these plants, how much preference there was to the straight species versus a fairly similar cultivar of it. And so by doing that, she was able to produce statistical numbers saying, okay, we know that Veronicastrum, Culver's root, the white variety attracted, I think it was 600 and something pollinators, where the straight species attracted as many, or excuse me, the cultivar lavender towers. That's this one right behind me. That was significantly more popular. So Annie White did this with, she had 500 plants that she documented over a series of a few years at 2 trial garden locations. And Mount Cuba, and you can visit Mount Cuba. I really like that destination, especially for us in the mid-Atlantic, because it's based in Delaware, and they've got about 15,000 square is it acres? They've got a large space. There's walking grounds and wild plants that you'll see in like a floodplain, as well as woodland setting, meadows, grasslands. And then they have this huge trial garden location. And that trial garden location, what they'll do is they'll take about 70 plants. And it's usually like, let me pull up, or I'll just flop it up here. So this was their study on echinacea. That is a lot of varieties of echinacea. And they will usually take anywhere from 2 years studying these plants to they will study specific plants sometimes for 10 years. They recently published the Amsonia trial garden results. And if you go to their website, that's mountcubacenter.org, right on the top bar, it says research. You can click on the trial gardens and it comes out, thank you, Sally, it comes out with this massive report. And so it gives you like their top 10 performers, as well as it'll have little tidbits about insects, and it'll say who performed better as far as sun versus shade with your coral bells, or which Phlox paniculata or Coreopsis was more powdery mildew resistant. So they're a fabulous resource and well worth the visit for anyone who enjoys visiting gardens or a good hike. They've got natives on natives, and they really do a wonderful job of showcasing them. Let's see. Also, you have Penn State has an entire like pollinator research department. And I believe Oregon, they're just starting to do some studies out there because they felt like it was very limited for the West Coast.
Oh, that's good for anybody who's attending from the West Coast. I know we do get people from around the country sometimes. Awesome. Can you tell me just for a second, the one you referred to behind you that was more popular than the straight species, which plant was that?
So that's Veronicastrum
Okay.
culvars root. Bear with me. This is going to be my first screen share. So I do have a bunch of slides that I pulled together of Virginia natives. So this is lavender towers. The straight species easily gets to be about 6 feet tall.
Oh, wow.
And it can get a little taller. This is a little bit more compact. It's between 4 to 5. And it also has a very purple flower color. So a lot of times when I'm learning about these research results, you'll get the kind of hypothesis as to why those plants were more preferred or less preferred compared to the straight species. So your bees, they belong to a group Hymenoptera, where your butterflies are Lepidoptera. The Hymenopteras see in like UV wavelengths. So purples and blues tend to be very receptive. So that
Gotcha.
could potentially contribute to why the cultivar lavender towers performed better than the straight species.
Gotcha. Okay.
A quick file share here. This is always so intimidating.
Oh, you got it.
Screen share. There we go. All right. So let me get to, we got to go all the way to the bottom here for the Veronicastrum. Okay. Stokesia. There. Okay, and then we go to view, slideshow. All right, so what you see on the left-hand side is Veronicastrum virginigatum. This is the results from Annie White's studies in Vermont. So the straight species, 616 visits by pollinators, where Veronicastrum virginicum lavender towers had 1,647 visits. So this was a significantly preferred cultivar. I do want to mention that every one of the studies says that it's super important to go with as straight a species as possible. And the reason for that is that's what's naturally occurring, and it's going to contribute to the biodiversity in an area. And then you also want to take into consideration that that biodiversity is those genes within the plant that have adapted over time. So that can also contribute to natural selection and more drought resistance or tolerance of more water. So we like our cultivars because, like Veronicastrum virginigatum, lavender towers, it's beautiful and purple. It gives us another color. And when I do the research and see that it's preferred, sometimes I may make the compromise on the straight species because I know those facts. And
Yeah, and it's a more manageable size.
yeah, and there's no like solid rule. Like ideally, yes, straight species as often as you can do it is going to be the best thing for nature. But I think that For me personally, I make compromises with cultivars based on if it performed really well. Before I get out of screen share, I will point out on the upper right-hand side, that is a map. So one of my other favorite resources is VA Plant Atlas. I believe that's another .org. And what you do is you type in the top in the search engine. I go by the scientific name, but you can also do common name, and it will pull up that plant if it is native to Virginia. And then what they do is they even mark which counties it's present to. So if you are someone who is a straight species all the way enthusiast and it has to be for your local area, this is a wonderful, wonderful resource. They have images. They also describe where it would naturally be growing. So Veronicastrum virginigatum would be growing in a meadow on the edge of a floodplain. All right, let's get out of screen share. Okay, there we go. I should also mention with the Mount Cuba Center, when they're doing these trial gardens, they try to mimic your actual garden, which is super nice. So they're doing as much watering as they have to, like absolutely have to get plants established within the first few years. But other than that, it's fairly minimal interference.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's awesome. Well, we're starting to get some questions in, so I don't know if you're ready to start taking some, but we have. All right, let's go. Everybody, please feel free to send in your questions. Caitlin and I have lots to talk about, so we definitely could, but we want to hear from you. All right, our first question is from Barbara and Sean. This is about Liatris spicata, which I know is one of your natives that you've mentioned to me a lot. Is that one where if you cut down the blossom stalks, will they rebloom? Actually, that's my question. Actually, is that common for a lot of these are perennial plants? So if you deadhead Liatris, are there any, will they rebloom, or does that work for perennials as well as annuals?
So with perennials, what you can do, because our perennials have that life cycle, they'll go from
Okay.
dormancy in the winter, vegetative growth, bloom, then they naturally want to go into seed so that they can self-propagate themselves prior to dormancy. A lot of the perennials, especially once they're in the ground and established, you'll notice the bloom period has become significantly larger with a larger plant. Deadheading will always encourage more flowers, but we can't tax them as much as we, like you could deadhead all season long. It's not going to keep, your creeping phlox blooming through August. It's just not going to be happening. But with Liatris, it's one of the ones that does not respond as quickly. So there are plants where I notice if I deadhead, I definitely get a longer bloom. One example of that is Agastache. Agastache is fabulous and a very long season bloomer. The Liatris, if you remove those first, because they do have the spikes that'll bloom, if you remove the first few as they're fading, you may encourage, because what the plant does is it's like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have seeds. If I don't have seeds, things are not going to work out for this population. I won't have the next generation. So they will produce a little bit more flowers, but we can't like really push something like Liatris that far. The same thing is true for my bee bombs. So with that, I'll point out. So Agastache is one of my absolute favorites. These are fairly similar in the look to Liatris spicata. Liatris spicata is going to be native to Virginia and this area. This is a cultivar of Agastache. This is more the southern, if not southwestern part of the United States. This is a hybrid cultivar called Morello. They bloom their faces off. And if I ever forget to remove something, like this guy's kind of looking a little spent, see how it's just starting to go. If I remove and I catch it in time, I'll go down to the next node, like right here. And you'll notice there's little tiny guys just starting to come up. So that's something Agastaches are going to perform really, really well with reblooming, where some plants don't necessarily do that.
Got it. So it's good to check if you want to have plants that you can deadhead and get longer bloom out of. Would you say it's good to check with some of the plant specialists to see?
Because some plants you can and some plants you can't.
Yeah.
Or experiment. If you're not sure, deadheading's not going to hurt it, except for when we're taking into consideration other wildlife that might use those plants. So for instance, your cone flowers. I have right here, this is your straight species Echinacea purpurea. Echinacea purpurea is not native to this area in Virginia. In fact, out of the 9 species that are native, There is one Levigata that's native to Virginia, and it's more the southern western point of Virginia. For whatever reason, though, we all identify with Echinacea as a native. I consider it the sweetheart of the natives because everyone who wants to do native gardening has Echinacea. It's got huge pollinator values. And once it goes to seed, you'll see a lot of songbirds feeding off of them. So when it comes to deadheading something like the Echinacea, you see how I've got all these little buds still on this? I may decide to cut this one flower once it's gone to seed to encourage more buds. But when I don't see any more buds at the base of my Echinacea, and this is just what I do at home, I keep them so that the birds have their food. I don't want to be deadheading excessively to where I'm, helping pollinators, but forgetting about the birds. Okay, next question.
Yes, and that actually was a question, was are coneflowers considered natives? Here's the follow-up question to that. How can we get them to spread? Mine seem to stay in a small clump.
So straight species tend to be a lot quicker to self-propagate. Whenever we've got things that are naturally occurring cultivar versus something that it has been hybridized between two different varieties of Echinacea, the hybridized versions, those cultivars, a lot of times they're not going to produce those seeds. And I will do a little screen share here for our cone flowers. Okay, so I need to get out of this. Hold on.
While you're looking, I'll just tell everybody because I got a question about this. I'm trying to share all the plant names, type them out as Caitlin says them, but whenever we have perennials, for those of you who attend PEGS classes, I usually have to confirm the spellings and then send them out after class. So I'll try, and just know we'll get you guys a list following class of the plant names that will be more accurate than anything I type.
And when I am able to do the screen shares, you'll be able to see some of those spellings as well.
Definitely.
I'm just waiting.
Yeah, I just always like to caution when I send perennials because they're, a lot of times we're dealing with scientific names and it's
a mouthful.
Not the same as sending out stuff like petunia. It's just a little bit more challenging. Yeah, but we'll get you guys those lists.
Just bear with me while this is uploading. I did see one of the pop-ups while we're just waiting for this to upload. Someone had asked what cultivar of Agastache that was. That was a cultivar hybrid called Morello. So Morello is a really nice deep pink bloom. And I'll go over the Agastaches while I have this up. So we'll do Echinacea really quick, and then I'll go to Agastaches because we did just start carrying the Agastache that is native to Virginia, which is Agastache nepetoides. It's
did
a
we
very,
really?
very tall white variety. And then neighboring states are host to Agastache funiculum, which is a blue variety. And then there's, the southwestern, very drought tolerant, very nice repeat bloomers. So where's my Echinacea page? The only issue with this is that there are 127 slides of different plants. So
there might be a search function, but I'm not sure how to make it work. I can fill in while you're looking. Take your time. Oh, there it is. Never mind. I'll tell everybody later.
It's taking a while to load because it's such a big file. It's a problem. And I'm not going to go into full slideshow screen anymore because I think that's kind of what shut it down. So apologies to everybody who's watching. So again, the Echinaceas, 9 species, all native to North America, different locations throughout North America, and then there are countless cultivars and hybrids. So one of my favorite things to do at work is just ogle on the pollinators. And so this is a really cool shot of very different cultivars getting hit on by insects. And most of the time you'll see it's these bumblebees or bombus, and they're less discriminating compared to the 30% pollinator specialists. And what those are bees that will only harvest nectar or pollen from one, maybe 2 different plant species, and that's what they live off of, or they will leave food for their larvae. So here is your Echinacea purpurea. This map is BONAP, which is the Biota of North America. So they do identify that Echinacea is present in the state of Virginia, but they're not discerning whether or not it's something that was introduced or naturally occurring. But you can see on the VA plant atlas map that they're identifying it as an introduced species. Now, Mount Cuba, their top performers were, and I try to list the ones that we have readily available, Peekabella, Sensational Pink, Santa Fe, Kismet Raspberry, also Glowing Dream. Top pollinator pick was Fragrant Angel, but you also have Kismet Raspberry was high on the list. So was the Glowing Dream. Magnus was up there, as well as I believe it was a white variety. Oh, the Fragrant Angel was the #1, but you also have Baby White Swan, which was another one. Next slide on echinacea. This is the Levigata. So you can see where it's native in Virginia, not necessarily in Fairfax County, but this is what the straight species native looks like. It is considered federally endangered and it is extirpated in Pennsylvania. So what extirpated means is that it used to occur naturally in a state and it no longer can be found there. So it's almost like extinction specifically for that state. This is another coneflower. This is Tennesseeanensis. This is federally endangered. It's only naturally occurring in a few counties in Tennessee. It did test a little low for the Mount Cuba trial gardens. The straight species got a 2.5. That's going to be the one down here on the right. Rocky Top is very similar to the Dark Shadows Wicked, which is a newer cultivar, so it wasn't part of that study. But the reason I'm pointing this one out is Echinacea tennesseeanensis, native to North America, not necessarily Virginia or Delaware where those studies were done. So maybe it just didn't respond as well as the purpurea or the levigatas. I will point out though, because it stays between 1.5 and 2 feet, that echinacea is the echinacea that they would make shorter hybrids with when you see short series like Kim's Knee High or Sombreros. Now, Echinacea augustifolia, they do use purpurea in supplements, but augustifolia is the main one that we will see in our drugstores. It helps with our immune systems. It was also used by Native Americans for a bazillion little things, but one of the cool ideas that I saw was that they actually used it to treat smallpox by mixing it with puffball spores. Those are the like explodey smoke mushrooms, and skunk oil. How you harvest skunk oil, I don't want to know. Now, again, on echinacea, here's a cultivar called Big Kahuna. Big Kahuna looks nothing like purpurea. A lot of times purpurea genetics are in the flowers because of such the wide petals on them. But it was probably hybridized with a Echinacea simulata to give you that yellow color. You can see on the bottom photo, this thing is crawling with skippers. That is a very popular cultivar that I have observed at the garden center compared to Echinacea Giddy Pink. So these really nice pom-pom echinaceas are great for the person that's violently allergic to bees and doesn't want bees in their garden. If you're planting echinacea for pollinators, due to all those petals, and you can see here in the top photo, there's a huge issue with access to nectar. So it's not going to be popular with your pollinators. And then last thing on echinacea, this is the list. Out of the 9 species native to North America, you have 7 that are listed as federally endangered or threatened. And the reason for that is echinaceas like prairies and grasslands. That requires a lot of space. And a lot of times our homes, urban sprawl, agriculture will displace these types of plants. So by doing a straight species, you are encouraging more self-seeding. They're going to be the ones that are going to do it more readily. And also planting echinacea is something that I personally enjoy doing, especially when I see all these numbers where I know that we, at some point might have a real issue obtaining and supporting echinacea as an actual plant. And then the agastache, which is right up here. Let's see, agastache. So agastache, anise hyssop, 20 species, most of which are native to North America, except for rugosa. Now, rugosa is going to be things like your black adders. That's a cultivar that's of a rugosa. Long blooming nectar source. That's why I used it as the example for deadheading. and it's host to Radcliffe's moth. Also very spicy. It's a mint that you can eat. They used to use it as a cure for head colds. The first on the left, that's Agastache funiculum. This is the straight species of, well, I'll show you once I get off the screen share, but I do have a straight species of it. Funiculum was compared in Annie White's studies, the straight species to Golden Jubilee. In this case, you can see that the straight species was way more popular, 973 pollinator visits versus the 566. You can also make cocktails by making an Agastache syrup. So while you're telling your friends all about your native garden, you could be hosting them with a homegrown cocktail. Agastache nepetoides is going to be the taller one on the right, and you can see the map just below it, as well as I have not found any sources or growers doing Scrophulariafolia. Apologies for the pronunciation on that. So that's going to be the Agastache that's strictly for us Virginia exclusive native growers. Now stop share. Okay, so this is your Agastache funiculum. This is the straight species. It is just finishing up its bloom period. So you can see the light purple flowers. This is it going to seed. So this is a good scenario for doing some deadheading and taking off some of the old stuff to encourage more blossoms. You notice I'm going down to where the leaves split as opposed to just leaving a little empty stick. That's not a good look. Also, it's still pulling xylem and phloem, but doesn't have any leaves that are actively contributing to the photosynthetic process of the plant. Now, Agastache nepetoides, this was one of the ones that was limited on availability. This is the white bloom, and you can see just
Is that
how
another straight species? It's huge.
tall this is. Extremely tall. And this is something that you would see growing in meadows, very close to like a woodland edge where a meadow begins. They can do full sun to part shade. So gorgeous. And that's our native Agastache. These, whenever I see stuff like this on availability, my boss and I try to line up ordering them so that we have them for customers, but it's very limited, the access to these, because only one grower decided to start growing them. So hopefully, because they sold out very quickly, that means that we're going to see more plants like this available for sale.
That's awesome. All right. So I just love this. This is all such good information for me. Okay, next question. This is a really good one to address because we get this in a lot of our classes. Can native plants become invasive? Can you talk about the difference between invasive and maybe an aggressive native? I think that's probably a good thing to hear.
And I could be brain burning, but invasive, you have like exotic invasives. Those are things that are not from this area. But then things that can grow aggressively that can take over a space, what that's doing is creating like a monoculture. So a really good example of that is panicum switchgrass, right? So, and I think I have a slide for that as well. Let's just pull that up. So panicum switchgrass actually hosts, I can't remember if it's 7 or 9 butterfly and moth populations. It's nectar within the inflorescence of that grass. Also, you'll see small native bees on those. So panicum is a fabulous, very texturally interesting grass for pollinators. But when it starts to spread really aggressively, which was the case, so there was this one study, and here's a list of some of the butterflies and moths that were hosted to it. The panicum to the right is the straight species. In above it, you've got cultivar Shenandoah, which is a little bit more tidy. It's only 3 to 4 feet tall. It also has more of a pronounced red foliage to it. They noticed that some cultivars of panicum, not all, but there were several cultivars that were spreading very aggressively. The reason for that is seed dormancy. A lot of times plants will not germinate prior to or before winter. And when they're able to do that, they can spread super aggressively. So a lot of times with our natives, we can get things that will spread aggressively. And if they do that, which in this study, they had like the entire ecosystem just turned into switchgrass. which depleted other native plant populations that other wildlife were dependent upon, not just the moths and butterflies that rely on the panicum switchgrass. So stop share right there. I also want to point out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have a huge space, something like this Picanthamum virginigatum or any of the mountain mints, these mountain mints spread just like any other mint. So bang for your buck, this is a fabulous plant. If you do not want something that's going to act that way because you have a smaller space, you either need to make a different selection. You could do what I do with some plants that spread very aggressively that are native and put them in a container. So I have a sensitive fern at home rather than having a Boston fern or a Kimberly Queen. I have a sensitive fern, and that thing is the most impressive, busting out of the pot. The container is like this big, and it's just this massive, well-contained native fern. Another option is doing good grooming. So in the spring, when you notice that your bee balm, I've got right here, this is Monarda didmia Jacob Klein. Jacob Klein actually tested better than the straight species, very popular with hummingbirds. They will grow insane. Like when most perennials will double in their width throughout a year, these will triple, if not quadruple. And it can be a lot of bee balm. So what I will do is I will go in with a hori knife or a sharp shovel very, very early spring, and I will take chunks off of it where it's exceeded the spacing that I want for this plant. Part of the reason for that is I can share it with friends. Also, I don't want it too pressed up against the neighboring coneflowers because that can cause less airflow, which contributes to powdery mildew with things like your bee balms. So there are options. You choose a different plant, you contain the plant, or you just do the work and share the plant with others.
That's good. So basically, like technically a native plant can't be invasive, but it can be very aggressive.
It can.
So
And
like
you also have the folks that will talk about it being invasive in a non-native state.
yes.
So
Okay.
if
Yeah.
you are growing something that is native to another state and it
It
starts
might be in,
acting crazy, then that would be considered, I guess,
yeah. So something,
invasive
yeah,
in that
because
state.
we're
Yeah.
talking, we could be talking about multiple states. So it could be invasive in California, but not invasive where we are. Yeah. All righty. Awesome. Next question from Jody. With regard to the number of visits for the bugs, I see lots of butterflies visiting my neighbor's butterfly bush, but hear that it's like junk food for the butterfly. How do we know that it's not nutritious? I actually haven't heard about nutrition from those plants before. Is that's
So
new?
there have been a few kind of limited quantitative studies on the nectar value of things, but there are folks that will collect it. And this is like, now we're getting into laboratories to be really figuring out the concentration of the sugar. But yes, results on the butterfly bush are that it is like, it's basically comparing it to like if I drink green tea in the afternoon, that's my little pick me up. It's not necessarily, that's my nectar. Where I could be drinking soda. I love soda. Soda's delicious, but probably not the best thing for me to be having all the time. So butterfly bushes are kind of like that. It's not giving any nutrition, but it is drawing them in. So I try not to be like, shame on you if you have a butterfly bush. I will mention that they do host stink bugs, so you might want to bear that in
I know
mind.
that.
But if you're going to use them as a lure or a trap to coax them into coming into your yard, then you really should have the more nutritious food available for them. I don't know if they're going to be like a well-behaved child where they eat their steak and potatoes prior to having their cake, but that's what we're here for, is to give you the information so you can make the educated
Yeah,
decision.
and then decide. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I had no idea about that. Alrighty, we'll move on. Next question's from Darla. Are natives naturally more deer resistant?
I've observed that a lot of times natives are more deer resistant. I will say, so like coneflower is another great example. They don't necessarily love eating coneflower, but they will eat coneflower. I have a mix of coneflowers, including the Echinacea tennesseeanensis. It's a shorter cultivar. And so I have yet to see a single bloom on it because of the
They
rabbit
just
in
keep,
my front yard,
oh, yeah,
because of
okay.
the height and the accessibility. But oftentimes the deer are not grazing on our natives. I think that's just part of the evolution. They will eat young
Yeah, they're
saplings,
maybe
they'll eat
evolved to have bitter
anything
flavor.
yeah, when it comes to desperation. But also another neat thing with the natives, the reason why they're host to a lot of caterpillars, like the Asclepias, your milkweeds, your butterfly weeds, all of those have that milky, sappy, poisonous kind of syrup in it. And that's what the caterpillars eat, which makes them less palatable. At the same note, Mount Cuba did host this very cool webinar in the wintertime called Wild Plant Culture with Jared Rosenbaum. Apologies if I didn't get his name right, but it's Wild Plant Culture. He's got a book and a nursery in New Jersey. And he was saying, imagine how much better it would be if we were living and eating the native plants that we're growing. So in that note, you've got things like he was saying with swamp milkweed, you could eat the freshly growing sprouts like asparagus and flower buds before they open up, or like a broccoli. You will absolutely have to do research on how to prepare that
Okay.
properly.
Yeah,
I
quick
eat
disclaimer, we can't make diet recommendations.
do not do
Don't go home
not
and do that.
I nibble on the things when I do the research and it says I can nibble on them. And sometimes I learn things the hard way. For
Yeah.
example, the echinacea, you can eat the flower petals on your echinacea. They taste like paper. I get nothing from them. But I'll also eat bluebell flowers just for the novelty of it. Super sweet, awesome, delicious, great flower to eat. You can eat their leaves. They're supposed to be like spinach. It is the most bitter spinach I have ever tasted. Agastache, the deer don't like it because it smells like a mint. It is strong and fragrant. Same thing with your bee balms. We used to use bee balms for tea. Agastache, you can do that syrup. Also, you can eat the leaves and the flowers. It's extremely spicy. It is not my favorite thing. On the opposite note, you have Blophylla salata, and that just grows along the shoreline. It's a wonderful plant if you've got a wet area. It's a great pollinator plant. And it's also in the mint family. So it'll spread crazy. The deer won't eat it. I read that you can eat it and that it's a mild mint flavor. It is so bland and like just awful, like eating a lamb's ear texture. It's so like if you're going to eat things, don't do it because I'm listing these examples. Do the research so we don't have any like
Yes, we
conversation
give no
lost.
advice on what plants to eat.
Yes,
Legal disclaimer there. We're
yes,
not recommending these things.
that's you have to do the research before you start eating things. And you also have to do the research on how to prepare them before you start going there. We went way too far off of the deer topic. But,
No,
but
well, something our Pat Riley, who's officially retired now, she was talked about how the plants that have a strong smell
yes.
deter deer because it's dangerous for them if they can't smell predators in the area. So things like agastache that smell like mint, like that makes sense.
And
Um,
asters are wonderful. Asters are a great late season bloomer. There are a bunch of asters that are native to North America. In fact, there's more asters that we do have that are native than the few that we carry that are not. But the asters, they are not toxic to dogs or to kids. Again, depends on how much your dog or kid are eating. They've also been used for medicinal purposes by Native Americans, but the deer don't like them. They might take a bite of it at a curious graze, if you will, but they're not eating asters. So if you want deer resistant and something that's going to be native, your agastaches, your asters, they're all going to be really good plants and they're not going to be harmful to pets or your family.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Next question. I think this actually combines two because we had a similar one just come in. With the unusual heat in Virginia, how often do we need to be watering established natives? And how often, so two scenarios here. How often do we need to be watering native plants that are established? And the second is how often do we need to be watering natives that were planted just this spring?
So very very big difference between this spring and something that's established. The established plants should be a heck of a lot tougher and a lot more durable. So ideally, we want to be holding off on our watering so we can develop tougher plants. Also, when we're not consistently giving water, what the plants do is their roots will reach down. I always compare it to like if I were blind and you put a glass of water right in front of my face, I'd be very easy to grab it right away. That would be my roots stopping where I'm getting the water. If the glass is here, I'm reaching further till I'm able to find what I need. So for that reason, we don't want to drown our plants. Also, plants respond very poorly to being excess water. Now, the question of how often am I watering a new thing, you're going to check on it fairly regularly. I do a lot of my planting in July and August because that is our less busy time of year. I check on those plants every day that it doesn't rain. That does not mean that I water them every day. It also depends on where they're located. I've got a pollinator garden. One side of it gets all morning sun, then there's a tree, and then the other side gets all afternoon sun. The side that is getting more sun throughout the day and the afternoon sun, those plants tend to need a little bit more of a helping hand from me than the ones on the other side. So when it comes to watering, new plants you want to check on. The best thing for the garden is the farmer's footprints. And you also want to be taking into consideration what type of plant you have and how much lighting is it getting. So this plant right here, Facella bipinnifolia or scorpion weed. It looks a lot like geraniums. It is a native plant. This is another brand new one that's available. So limited availability, but a brand new native plant. This is something that it says it can tolerate moisture and it can grow in part sun to shade. So if I know that we're right in the sweet spot, oh, it's from Sally here, I'll hold it up. So it's zones 5 to 8,
Thank you.
which means that it's going to be just if it had to lean in one direction, it would be cooler climates, which means in Virginia, we probably want to put it in a little bit more shade. And that means we're not necessarily going to give it as much water as it might want. So something that tolerates moist soils, when something says I tolerate moist soils, if it's in more sun, it's going to tolerate more moist soils. If it is in deeper shade or part shade, it's going to be less water because it's not doing as much photosynthesis and it's not getting as cooked and the soil around it isn't going through as much transpiration. So it's really important to pay attention, even with our natives, because natives that are native to Virginia are also necessarily native to right above us and farther north. So we're going to treat that native differently than if we were in Connecticut. And same thing, a native to Virginia that goes down to Florida, that's going to be something that doesn't require as much water as when it's in the warmer climate of Florida. So
Yeah.
it's important to know your plants, know where they're growing, check on the babies, and try to not spoil them too much.
Are you finding with the current weather, are the plants are having any particular issues? Like, is the weather particularly hot this summer? Is there a lot of drought? Is there anything anybody should know about current weather conditions?
So the weather is extremely, it's brutal. I live in Reston and we've got a lot of like meadows and native planting locations where they have set up basically native pollinator gardens in medians. We always want more of those. So if anyone's listening from the rest, which they know, but at any rate, those plants, no one's out there watering them. They're established. I know the first few years they did a little bit minimal watering, but they're okay until there was like a couple days, maybe a week or two ago, when it was consistently 100 degrees and we hadn't had just a little rain break. And I noticed all of the leaves were getting flat on these native plants. So you would see, for example, like all the leaves would just start doing this where they're tipping down.
Droop, bad, yeah.
They looked better in the morning when after it cooled off, and then by the afternoon you would see sad plants. And then eventually we got rain and they were fine. So a lot of these plants, can suffer, like can survive some of those drought-like symptoms, which is why it's good to push your plants, but not all plants bounce back really well. Like if you continually neglect something, the buds might drop off of it. It might shut down, it could even die. So native plants, they may need a helping hand, especially in a garden setting, and especially if they're new. There's no equation, it's just very specific to where you have them, how much light, what their zones are, and what their preferences are.
So talk to a plant specialist if you need a lot of information on the plant you're planting. They can help you with your specific circumstances.
And do
Um,
companion planting, like based
yeah,
off of where you're growing it, what type of climate it is, pick a bunch of them that are going to behave really, really well together. So the Veronicastrum, something that'll grow in meadows or even along stream sides, this would be a fabulous companion plant with the native verbena. This is Verbena histata. This is one that will spread aggressively by seed, but this will tolerate moisture. You could plant that with your swamp mallow, your hibiscus moschutos. That's another great combo. And also Coreopsis palustris. That is swamp Coreopsis. It will also grow really well with those. If you have a low point in the garden that's getting at least 4, if not 6 hours of direct light, that's going to be a good location. If we get a dry spell, you may have to assist with it, but you want the right plants for the right place, and they need to be with the right homies.
sounds good. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to rattle off. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to rattle off a few plants here that we have people asking if they're native. So you can say native, not native, or
Yes.
whatever other answer.
I'm going to go to screen share. So as you're going, if I can pull them up, I will.
Perfect. All right. Black-eyed Susan, are those native? This person's noticing that they are spreading aggressively in their yard.
Well, that is a good problem to have. Black-eyed Susans are native. So Rudbeckia fulgitia, the straight species, had 119 visits by pollinators, cultivar Goldstrom 120. Rudbeckias will spread. So fulgitia is native to Virginia as well as our county, in Fairfax County, where you see the garden centers. So it's also host to the wavy-lined emerald moth and silvery checkered spotted butterfly. So that's your Rudbeckia fulgitia. Also native a little further west in different counties, you've got Rudbeckia hirta. That's your black-eyed Susans. These guys can be a short-lived perennial, if not even biennial in their tendencies. So this is one that you will see often spread by seed. You also have Rudbeckia laciniata, or your cut-leafed coneflower. That's going to be another native Rudbeckia. And then very, very little availability in the southwestern part of Virginia is Rudbeckia triloba, or your three-leafed coneflower. So all of these Rudbeckias are going to be native to the state of Virginia. I may have excluded a few, so apologies to those species, but Rudbeckias are native and they can spread fairly aggressively by seed. You can try if you want something that's a little bit more manageable. There's a Rudbeckia fulgitia little gold star. It is a dwarf variety. That's something that you could use in the front of the garden bed, and it's less likely to self-propagate like those that are more similar to their straight species relatives. I should also mention that Mount Cuba did a bee study. It was between 2018, 2019, where they collected bees, did bee counts, and Rudbeckias were listed as one of the essential native plants for pollinators in your garden. All right, next question.
Next question. Okay, next plant. Queen Anne's lace. Is that native?
You know, Queen Anne's lace, I haven't done too much research on, because as far as its availability, we only get it from one grower who provides us with the line caterpillar candy. So what they do is they've got plants, and on the labeling, they've got a picture of the plant itself, the insect, the larval insect that it's host to. So you'll see a caterpillar and then the butterfly that it grows into. We carry Queen Anne's lace for that reason, but I will have to look that up, or if you can send your email so that we can respond to you. Queen Anne's lace, I'm just not certain on, because I don't work with it professionally as much.
Okay. Okay. Next one, milkweed.
Yes. Milkweed, absolutely. Let's go to the milkweed slide.
Yeah, I know there's quite a few milkweeds and some that are best in Virginia.
Absolutely. And some are more preferred by the monarch caterpillars than others. Okay,
Oh
so
yeah, yeah, because milkweed. He's at this person. Michael is his name, asking if they're native. That's actually the host of the monarch butterfly.
correct.
So that's like a really good native.
It's also host to the tussock moth caterpillar. I was hunting for caterpillars and I found a bunch of funky guys. So it's not exclusively host to monarchs, but it is definitely the known host to monarchs. So this is from the caterpillars that we had from last year as well as this year. So this is them going through the process of the caterpillar on the left that had been eating the Asclepias to the chrysalis to the monarch butterfly. They then will nectar feed off that plant and lay their eggs on the Asclepias. Now, and to go back to that, over 200 species of Asclepias globally and about 100 to North America. So you do have some in Asia and South America as well. Now, Asclepias incarnata or swamp milkweed, that is huge. You can see that across the board as being native to Virginia. This is going to get 4 feet tall. It also tolerates a lot more soil moisture. So when choosing Asclepias, if you don't have a garden that has more moist soil or you don't keep up with watering really well, you may want to consider Asclepias tuberosa. So this is your butterfly weed. It stays between 1.5 to 2 feet. This is a wonderful variety. I planted some last year and then also this year. The one from last year I've watered twice throughout the entire season. It's in morning sun, 6 hours, so that could be a very different scenario if it was on all day sun. The ones I planted this year, I've watered maybe once a week, but again, it depends on where you're growing it and how long you've had it. Also, while we're talking Asclepias, Asclepias tuberosa was tested by Annie White at the University of Vermont. Hello Yellow had 331 visits documented compared to the 230 visits. And this is for pollinators nectar feeding, not as a host plant. The cultivar, very similar, aside from the color differentiation. Hello Yellow, Annie White presumes is something that naturally occurred, and it's something that we continue to cultivate because we like that yellow color. But it had a higher winter survival rate as well, which is not often the case with some cultivars. I believe there was other species where like the cultivars were less winter hardy than the straight species. So again, no rule of thumb, it's very specific to the plants. Asclepias syringia, extremely common. There he is, Jared Rosenbaum. So wild plant culture, this is him talking about, excuse me, eating the Sericea. Don't do it. I'm telling you not to do it, as Sally and I were joking about earlier, but you need to have done your research before you're eating plants that have toxic components to it. Now,
Yeah.
Asclepias perennis, Sally, do you remember we were talking about plantings and that you're located in Florida?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's ours, right?
yes, this
Yeah.
is one, and I really love the Asclepias perennis. It's something that is just a really pretty white flower, and it's a lot shorter than the other swamp milkweeds, although it's probably going to tolerate a little bit less water in Virginia for how north we are in its climate zones. So this is a great one for Florida where it would grow in really wet settings.
Yeah, and I live on a tidal marsh, like a freshwater tidal marsh. So I've been trying to get our condo people to help to plant those around.
And you want to
They keep
double
getting
check
wanted
on it if
down.
it grows coastally. So some plants can tolerate salt where others cannot. I think
Yeah.
Asclepias perennis might be one of those. Now you also have Asclepias curvisica, or red, also known as tropical milkweed, native to South and Central America. Asclepias curvisica has been brought up a few times when we're discussing pollinators, that having it in certain yards, I know this was mentioned in California, that having it growing and still blooming tricks the monarchs into not migrating. And then another thing is when our natural and native Asclepias, they have their life cycle, they disappear when the butterflies need them to, where if we have something that's going to be longer lived, longer foliage, longer flowers, there's more generations of butterflies visiting that plant. And what that does is it increases the likelihood of exposure to a protozoal parasite called OE. So if you are planting the tropical milkweed, which is very nice and it blooms its face off, you need to be responsible and cut it back at certain time periods, especially when we get to fall, so that you're limiting exposure from the numerous amounts of butterflies that are visiting. And that is from the Xerces group. That is another, like, you want to talk about people that do their pollinator research. If you are a diehard pollinator, Xerces, just look up the many books they've produced. That's it on the Asclepias. Next plant.
Alrighty, we have 1 minute left. So that I'll ask you 2 questions and then we'll have to wrap up. So I'll close out with some notes and then let you hand it off. But here's our final 2 questions. The first is, are there any native roses that you're aware of, or would that be more of a question for our shrubs team?
It's definitely more of a question for the shrubs team, but there were 2 native roses that we had carried at the Gallows Road location. Very limited supply on those. I know one of them was the Caroliniana.
Okay.
Caroliniana.
Okay, so I'll say to any customers, anyone who's on here, if you're interested in native roses, call one of our stores and we can help you with that. That's a question that really goes to our shrubs team because we have a whole department for shrubs and trees. So, all right, next question, and this will have to be our last one. So I'm just going to remind everybody before I ask this and we start to wrap up, please feel free to follow up with us. My email has changed. You can still email my old email, sburrows. I got married, so I'm Sally Tickell now. So I'll type that email address out. You'll also see the emails come from me from a different name. It's still me, for those of you who are regulars. So please feel free to follow up. Caitlin works primarily at our original store on Gallows Road. We call it the Merrifield location. It's the original. So you can call her there. You're welcome to come find her there. And of course, if you have plant clinic questions or anything else, you can contact all of our stores. So I'm going to type my email out while I ask you the last question, Caitlin, which is, in this heat of summer, do you have a top few native plants you would recommend if people want to go plant native plants now? What are the most heat tolerant native plants you can think of?
Well, goldenrods are a pretty tough customer. Goldenrods are also one that is an extreme host. I'm just gonna pull that up really quick. Like over 100 insects that they are host to. So goldenrod is a tough ride or die. The butterfly weed, the Asclepias tuberosa, that is extremely drought tolerant. So that is a great plant. Who else is gonna be really tough? I mean, most of the agastaches, like I said, this is a variety, a cultivar of a South American, or not South American, Southwestern US. Same thing with this one, Queen Nectarine, another hybrid. These guys love their heat. They're used to warmer climates than what we have in Virginia. The humidity can be a little bit daunting for some of them, but they're a very tough customer. You'll see bees and butterflies on them. I notice more hummingbirds on these style of agastache versus your bigger flowered ones. They're going to be the ones for your bees. I would be very wise if I were planting a taller variety like the Nepetoides or the Funiculum, because you're going to have to keep up with more watering than you would for something that's going to be more of a South American variety. Also, planting this time of year, Sedum ternatum is always a good thing to plant because it's drought tolerant. It can go in shade. It's a fabulous, and it will also tolerate a little bit more water than most sedums. So sedum's a tough one. If you've got a very wet location and you don't have to worry about the watering, then you can do your hibiscus moschutos and not have to babysit it because it's already in a really moist spot in the yard.
Are those like dinner plate hibiscus?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
the flowers are like beside, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a lot of things you can plant this time of year. There's just some things you have to babysit more than others.
Okay.
The tuberose is one of the easier answers, and the agastache that is more drought tolerant are great.
Okay. Awesome. Oh man. Well, I know we could keep going and probably talk about native plants forever, but we do have to cut it off. As I said, please feel free to follow up. You can follow with me by email. You can visit Caitlin at the store. You can call your local store. Lots of ways to get in touch with us. We'll be back. I can't remember the exact date, but we've got classes on woodland gardens and hydrangeas coming up, online classes, and then we'll be starting up. There's more classes for the fall being added to the calendar. So I hope everybody's enjoying their summer vacations. Caitlin, Thank you so much for joining us today and chatting with me and with everybody here about native plants. I hope we can do this again. Do you have anything you'd like to close out with before we wrap up?
Just I really appreciate everyone logging on. I really appreciate everyone supporting the native plants. So I'm just grateful. I'm also grateful this was my first Q&A, so I don't feel like I was given too hard of a run on it. So thank you everyone for that. It's just never enough time and there's never enough research. So I encourage everybody to use the resources I had mentioned, but also reach out to us because it's one of my favorite things. And a lot of us at Merrifield love, love, love our
Yes,
natives. There
yes,
are
there's a
so
lot of
many
us.
people that we had in the wintertime. There's a native plant symposium and a bunch of our colleagues have attended it. So expand your own knowledge, come see us for other knowledge. And the more that you're buying those straight species natives, or if you're going to be purchasing something that is very similar to a straight species native, you're less likely to throw off the insects. Same color, same height, same bloom time. That's what we're looking for. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Well, everybody have a great day and do look for our notes tomorrow. We'll be following up with that. Have a good day. Bye, Caitlin.